Welcome to this short recorded seminar on multilingual classrooms and multilingual pedagogies. This seminar builds on earlier work that where we looked at the rise of the term translanguaging and what it means in terms of a system of language and a theory of language. Now we're going to look at really the practicalities of developing multilingual pedagogies. So we're going to talk a little bit about why the shift from mono to multi, what was behind that. And then we're going to look at the theories of multilingual pedagogy and some of the practice. And this module comes with quite a lot of extra recorded content as well from myself and from other people. So I'd encourage you to continue your learning through the additional activities. So we're just making sure we know who we're talking about. Who are our multilingual learners? Our multilingual learners are students who are learning academic content in a language which is also being learned. And so remember the two hats analogy we talked about, where they have a language hat and a content hat. And so they have specific needs for additional support in terms of their language development and their content development. So if we put the learner at the center, there are two quotes that I think encompass the why of the shift from monolingual approaches to multilingual approaches. The first is kind of the holistic whole child approach. It's a wonderful quote from Jim Cummins about educating the whole child. If we tell children their languages and culture are not welcome in our classes and our schools, we're essentially creating an exclusive environment. We're not being linguistically inclusive. And so that's kind of the socio-emotional reason why. Also, practically speaking, if we want children to learn something complex, the easiest way for them to do that, the easiest way for us to teach them that is through a language they already know. And so in this shift away from thinking that monolingual pedagogies are the right thing, we're looking at it from the well-being perspective, but also just from the impact on learning perspective and what we know about student engagement and learning. And so just a reminder of what that key research is. First and foremost, we know that students' linguistic development is stronger when they access at least a part of their education through their own language. And so that's, a lot of research coming from, for example, from UNESCO that shows that children's linguistic outcomes when they're educated in a language other than their own language are not as strong. The second kind of really consistent thing we know from research is that students' academic success is stronger when they, again, access at least a part of their education through their first language. And indeed, UNESCO says one of their pillars is educate children in a language they know for at least the first 6 years. So they're quite firm on that. It doesn't always happen. The world is complex, but that is what they believe is the right thing for children. And the final piece is students have increased engagement and well-being when they access education, at least partly through their own language. And so here we can see that the research very strongly pushes us towards ensuring that every child is engaging in their own language through their education. Whether or not they access all of their education depends on their context. So for example, here in the UK or in international schools, you might have classes with 16 languages. So obviously you can't just create a bilingual program for every child. And so as we looked at when we looked at bilingual education, where a bilingual model isn't possible, we can engage bilingualism and multilingualism in the classroom in ways that are thought to be effective as well. So the question we're going to try and answer is, how do we integrate all of the students' language resources into our classroom in meaningful ways? And that's really important. It's not just randomly saying, what is this in your language, but really that thoughtful part of the teacher planning that looks at how will languages be a part of their process. So I already mentioned the term translanguaging. But it's called multilingual pedagogies, and it's called multilingual pedagogy because translanguaging is one term we use to describe a multilingual pedagogy or a multilingual way of thinking and doing from the Welsh, and we'll look at the origins of that. But there are other names for it, and so I want to be clear that it's not an exclusive term that we use. Fred Genesee and Elsa Hamian have done some wonderful work on a very similar approach that they call bridging, which I quite like as a metaphor. You bridge from one language to another for children. And Ernesto Macro at the University of Oxford and lots of colleagues and connections that he's made have done a very long-term research on what they call pedagogical code switching, which is excuse me, sometimes contested as not being translanguaging, but sometimes indeed lots of people think that it's the same thing. And we're going to talk about that, how it is contested a little bit at the end. Multilingual pedagogies aren't new. They've been happening for as long as multilingual children have been in education of any form. And you can see it, for example, if you go into classrooms in India, you can see teachers using the children's other languages to help them learn or to help support them. It's only really new in contexts where monolingualism is the norm and where a lot of the teachers are monolingual and don't share the languages of their children. But as a concept, the idea of leveraging children's languages for learning in their educational experiences is not new at all. It's just often been regarded as not the right way to do it. So the origins of the word translanguaging, or the original Welsh trausieithu, they kept it secret in Wales for a very long time by calling it trausieithu, and nobody knew what they were talking about. The English word translanguaging was only coined in about 1996 by Ken Williams. And so it was essentially an observed pedagogy in Welsh medium schools where they had a lack of resources in Welsh. So the students were, for example, reading the history book in English and then talking about it in Welsh and writing about it in Welsh, or watching a video in English and then and presenting about it in Welsh. And so it was developed from the practice of teachers, not from researchers. It was an observed pedagogy that seemed to lead to really stronger learning outcomes for students. So what they saw was this language integrated pedagogy had positive effects on learning and language development. And so it remained kind of part of the Welsh education system from the 80s and into the late 90s, when it was written about in Colin Baker's Foundations of Bilingualism and Bilingual Education for the first time. And he began working with Ophelia Garcia from New York, who then took it to the United States, and then it kind of grew in lots of different ways. So this is the original definition associated with that pedagogy in Wales. So translanguaging is the planned and systematic use of two languages inside the same lesson by specifying and varying the languages of input and output. So that's the example I gave you, reading the textbook in English and writing about it in Welsh. I've extended this original Welsh definition a little bit. I've added in a middle step that I call processing, and I'll explain why when we look at the translanguaging cycle as I use it, but it's to do with especially monolingual teachers working with multilingual students. But essentially, this is what it is. It's looking at your lesson and going, how are we going to integrate two different languages, two per student? It doesn't have to be only two if you have kids with different languages, in ways that are beneficial for their learning. So one of the things we know is that translanguaging happens in classrooms that have what Garcia calls a translanguaging stance. So a translanguaging stance is really just a classroom environment that is supportive of multilingualism and how multilinguals use languages. So there are four elements that she thinks are important for teachers to nurture. First of all, that we're supportive of our students as they do complex learning in a language they're still acquiring. And so that's the thoughtful process behind, well, we're going to be reading Romeo and Juliet. These students are new to English. They won't understand it. Obviously, they need to read Romeo and Juliet in their own languages, that kind of basic level where we just make good pedagogical decisions. The second element of the translanguaging stance is providing opportunities for students to develop their linguistic practices for academic context, particularly. And this is about bridging from the school language to the home language to make sure that they're building both of those languages at the same time. The third is to make space for students' bilingualism and ways of knowing. This is a really interesting concept, this idea of ways of knowing. But what it really refers to is the fact that the way we express ourselves in different languages can influence how we think about things, or how we view the world, or how we view our culture, or any, like a poem that we're reading. And so in multilingual classrooms, we have to make sure that there's space for all of our students to come in and go, well, that's actually not the way we do it where I'm from. We write poems very differently than you write poems in English. And so it's just really that kind of enhancing the content of the classes. And finally, to support students' socio-emotional development and bilingual identities. There's a growing body of research that shows that identifying as a bilingual has a positive impact on student academic success. Actually, no matter what their level of their home language is, if they identify as a bilingual, they seem to do better. And so we really want to develop their identity not as a learner of the school language, not by, again, what they don't have, but by what they do, which is they are becoming bilingual or they are bilingual. And so the translanguaging stance needs to be present in your classroom before you can attempt the translanguaging pedagogy. Because if you don't, essentially what happens if you go in cold is the students are like, well, you've never asked us to do anything like this before. We don't really know what you're doing. And so we do have to have a classroom that feels linguistically inclusive before we start developing and experimenting with the pedagogy. So there are kind of largely what we consider to be two types of translanguaging that happen in the classroom. The first is serendipitous or spontaneous. This is the kind of moment-to-moment support that students give each other or that the teacher gives the students so that they can keep up with content and just understand and be able to, be able to participate. And so, for example, if you give instructions to something and one little Japanese speaking child speaks to another, what did the teacher say to do? And the child says in Japanese, the teacher said to do this. Oh, okay, that's fine. Or, what's that word? Or I'm not sure what to do. It's that translanguaging that happens naturally. And it's just about having everybody participate and keep up. The second, and the one we'll focus on more in this particular seminar, is the planned translanguaging, how the teacher goes about planning for language integration in ways that make sense, in those meaningful ways, and that we have a sense of why we want to do it and what we want the impact to be. So the serendipitous or spontaneous translanguaging happens naturally in most classes, especially if you have a translanguaging stance. But even in classes that don't accept it, it will happen. It will just happen behind the hand or while the teacher's not looking, because it's just a support strategy that students need. The plan side is where the teacher designs and manages language purposefully as a part of the curriculum approach. So not kind of incidental, but really as a part of their development of the learning journey of the students. I've identified what I think are three purposes for translanguaging. The first two come from that original Welsh work, to scaffold content or language, and I've added a third one. So the first one is to provide access for content for students who are not strong enough in the school language to follow the concepts or content, to make sure that all of our learners can keep up with learning. It's really important that they aren't left behind and not able to access the content simply because the level of the school language isn't good enough. The second is to scaffold language. We know that we can work from what the child already knows and can do linguistically to build that capacity in the new language. And so if a child knows how to say good morning in their own language, we can say, well, this is like bonjour, but in English we say good morning. And they go, okay, well, I know what that is and how to use it. And so we can use their strength in their own language, in their dominant language, to build the new language. And the third purpose, and I think of growing interest as we start talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in particular, is to enrich the content for all of our learners, bringing in experiences and learning through all of the languages of the classroom allows us to really enrich our content and bring in different perspectives and different contents from different parts of the world. So, for example, I've worked with international schools where they had all of the students research what led to World War I in like 14 or 15 different languages. And it's slightly different when you read about it in different languages. So they have a more nuanced understanding of what led to World War I than they would have if they'd only read about it in English. And so that's really valuable. And then also bringing in content from different parts of the world. So if you're doing a unit on poetry, as I mentioned earlier, poetry is done one way in English, but there are other poetry conventions that are very rich in other languages. So Arabic has an entire kind of history with poetry that's really, really rich. And so having your Arabic speaking students bring that in and talk about that is really going to enrich the students' understanding of poetry and also their orientations to cultural and linguistic diversity. So these are the three reasons why we do it. Now we're going to talk about how do we decide when to do it. So the first thing that we think about is the content. Are there aspects of this content that will be inaccessible for some of my students? So remembering our BICS and CALP, academic versus conversational fluency, things that are conceptually challenging, or even just things that are unfamiliar culturally, will be difficult to access through a language that's being learned. So if we answer the question, yes, there are aspects of this content that will be inaccessible to some of my students, then we ask ourselves, how are we going to go about supporting them, setting them up for success? Is there work that they can do at home by themselves or with their parents to build their understanding, so to fill their content hat before they come to class and work on the language? Can I put them in pairs or in groups to work together because I have kids who share the same language? Or is it as simple as sourcing a parallel core text so that as we're reading Romeo and Juliet in English, some of the students are reading it in their own languages and then learning about it in the class in English to make sure that they understand Romeo and Juliet first and foremost, and then they can talk about it and write about it. Because if they simply don't understand it, then they have no opening into that whole content area. So perhaps you ask yourself the question, are there aspects of this content that will be inaccessible to some of my learners? And your answer is no. Does that mean that you forget about translanguaging? Not necessarily. Then you ask yourself the question, are there any aspects of this topic that make sense for learners to approach in their own language? So are we working on something that's to do with culture or identity, or perhaps we teach in a school where there's a lot of local knowledge that's encoded in one of the languages of our students. And so we can draw on that to connect our students to the local context. So we can ask ourselves these questions and decide if there's not necessarily a support need for translanguaging, but if it will enrich the content or make the learning journey in some way kind of more effective or more rich for our students. So the next section is just a whole list of classroom strategies. And so I'm going to ask you to go through them one by one. I'm not going to talk to them because I want this to be your own work. I'm going to summarize at the end. But what I'd like you to do with each of the classroom strategies is to decide if you think the example is translanguaging or not. Yes, no, or maybe. And then I want you to think about the potential impact on both language development and learning of the particular activity that the teacher has chosen. And then if you want to, if you're ambitious, you can decide how you could improve it to make it better. So I'm going to go through the first one with you, and then I'm just going to go through the next ones, and you can pause on each one. So here's the first one. A teacher introduces 2 to 3 key vocabulary words and their definitions at the beginning of a lesson. So is this translanguaging, yes or no? Obviously not, because there's no use of other languages. So the potential impact on language development is that there might not be any. If the students don't understand those vocabulary words, they're not going to learn them effectively. And that may impact those learning, because if those are key vocabulary words and you have students who don't understand them, essentially they're not going to be able to learn effectively whatever the rest of the activity is. So this is a non-translanguaging example. Next slide, we've tweaked it a little bit. We've made a little change. Here we have a teacher introduces 2 to 3 English vocabulary words and their definitions at the beginning of a lesson and asks the students to translate the definition into their own language. So is this translanguaging, yes or no? I would say debatable. It's translation, but it's only really translanguaging if we know the students understand those definitions and will be able to use them effectively. And so in this one, we're not sure yet about the potential impact on language development and learning development because we don't know how effective it is to get the students to translate the definition to their own languages. So here I would say the input is the teacher introducing the vocabulary words and their definitions. The processing is asking the students to translate the definition into their own languages. But then we need to do something to make sure that actually they've understood them well. So you might group them by language pairs and get them to check their understanding. You might get them to use the word in a correct sentence in their own language and then translate that sentence to make sure that they can use it effectively in English. This is incomplete translanguaging. We've not kind of thought through what, excuse me, what the outcome of this will be, because just a straight definition isn't necessarily going to be enough. So to improve this, I would say input, introduce the vocabulary and their definitions. Processing, put students in the same language groups and ask them to translate and make sure they understand those words. If you don't have same language groups, I might send that home to the parents if the kids are younger. I might have them do that kind of write and translate back. And then the output would be they use the sentences of the words effectively in an English sentence to show their understanding. So for me is incomplete. So that's the kind of the process I'd like you to go through on the next slide. So I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to show them to you for long enough for you to pause, do the activity, and then we'll do a little wrap at the end. So here we go. Okay, I hope that gave you some good food for thought. What I want you to take away from all of those various activities is that implementing what I would call a surface or a shallow translanguaging pedagogy is quite easy. And we see it a lot, what's this in your language? We have multilingual word walls, things like that. But actually the depth of the pedagogy requires a bit more thought. So a lot of those were a surface level, teachers doing a word for word translation, here you go. But a word for word translation isn't useful to students. The short summary is useful. So we always need to think about, why might I do it? What do I think the impact will be? And then how do I, as a teacher, make sure that I know what's happening while the students are doing learning in other languages? And so you really need to think about this idea of input, processing, and output as being key to integrating it in a really consistent way. So input is anything that's teacher knowledge building. Knowledge building, teacher presentation, reading, watching videos, researching, doing surveys, whatever they're doing to build their understanding of a topic. Processing is how they're figuring out how it all fits together, taking their notes, making sure they understand it, doing matching activities, whatever it is they're doing to grapple with that knowledge. And then output is how they show us what they learned. So it could be written or verbal or a poster or, whatever it is that they do. But it's how at the end point, even if they've been doing things in languages that are not the school language, we still need to know what their learning has been over that. And so, for example, if you work in an English medium school, the vast majority of the time, if your students are past the beginner level, the output needs to be in English because they need to learn English because that's the language they'll be examined in. And so while it is good for them to use their other languages, we can draw on research about, the development of the first language and things like that. We still need to recognize that we have to help them also acquire the school language to the level that will allow them to be academically successful. And so we can't just have them do things in their own language. We need to think about what's that next step. Okay. So in some of the additional videos, the video content that's up on the webpage or on the Moodle page, you'll find other examples and other, kind of extended examples around this idea of how we really dig into translanguaging. Does the age of the students make a difference if we're using multilingual pedagogies? Absolutely. With our younger learners who are not literate yet, that multilingual environment, that multilingual stance is really important for students to feel comfortable. So coming into a classroom when you're 3 or 4 years old and nobody understands you and you don't understand anybody, is not necessarily a happy time for children. And so being in an environment where the students know who speaks their language or which teacher has Google Translate and will help them use the speaker button, working with the parents, making those partnerships. That's all just really important to make sure that A, students feel included and B, that they feel safe and secure in their environment. But there's less use of translanguaging in the actual curriculum because the students don't work independently. So it would be more, for example, sending the story home to the parents and saying, please read this in your language at home, so that when your child comes, they understand what the story's about and we'll read it in English. And so it's less kind of structured and more supportive. With our older learners, students who are literate in their own language can use other language text independently. And so we can do a lot more around research or reading in their own languages. Also, students who arrive in higher years of schooling, new to the school language, need a lot of content support from their dominant language because there's no way after 1 year in English school, they're going to be able to understand Shakespeare. And so there's a more pressing need for us to think about content access with older learners. And also cognitive maturity, which happens around 11 to 12 years old, means that students can use two languages quite strategically. If we say to them, these are the questions I want you to answer, go research them in your own language, they can do that because they know what it means to answer questions and they know what it means to research, and they can bring that together, answer them in their own language, and then use whatever strategies they need to put them into English so you can understand their answers too. And so with non-literate older learners, we need to think a little bit more carefully about how we structure pair work or group work, or how we use Google speaker buttons, or how we work with adults outside the school who can support them. Does the context make a difference? Again, yes. A bilingual environment where all of the learners speak all or most share the same language, share the same first language, gives us a lot of space for that really robust cross-linguistic experience. And so a lot of the research on translanguaging from the United States is happening in classrooms with mainly Spanish speakers. The teachers also speak Spanish, and so you can see how robustly they're able to do that because everybody has the same repertoire, just to different levels. It is, though, important in this kind of environment to manage language use to a certain extent. Although some people get very, very upset when you talk about managing language use. It is important that they not always default to their stronger language, because they do need to use and learn the school language as well. And so we need to find a balance between respecting their agency and their development of their own language and their access to learning, and that pressing need to acquire the school language. So one thing that you can do, and I'll talk about in a following slide, is to develop classroom language policies that help find that balance between use of and respect for the home language and development of the school language. In a linguistically diverse environment where you have students from many language backgrounds, it's not as easy to plan for group work or pair work because you don't always have those groups or pairs. So there's often more independent use of their first language. So, for example, doing research or reading or talking with parents, things like that. And planned translanguaging works better with older learners in a linguistically diverse environment because you can rely on their own ability to engage in their own language without the use of same language peers. But in this case, the multilingual integrated pedagogy is really important for identity and inclusion and developing awareness of how their own language works and how English works. And so the need is equal or in both environments, but it's not, the process isn't the same. And there are different tensions. So for example, in heritage language immersion programs, so for example, in Gaelic immersion in Ireland or in Welsh immersion in Wales, they tend to push away from translanguaging because they're worried if they let the kids use English, because English is the L1, it will detract from their learning of the heritage language. And so the relative status of the two languages is really important in understanding your environment and what the push and pull factors are for each of them. So through the work in Wales and through the wider work, there have been 4 potential advantages of translanguaging identified. The first is it can promote deeper and fuller understanding of the subject matter. Learning about it in a language you know well means you can learn it more fully. It can help the development of the weaker language. So to build from strong to the weaker language is a good strategy as well. Can help facilitate homeschool links and cooperation. So if you're working with parents who aren't comfortable in the school language, the best thing they can be doing is doing work or homework or engaging with their children at home in their own language. And so by valorizing the home language and by showing the parents that what they do in the home language is just as important, we can build better relationships and better supportive partnerships. And finally, it can help the integration of fluent speakers with early learners. And so, for example, if you have two children in your class from a Polish background, one who's stronger in Polish and one who's stronger in English, pairing them to work together is beneficial for both. So the one who's stronger in Polish can support the one who's losing their Polish, and the one who's stronger in English can help the one who's still learning English. And so we can integrate those languages and children can learn from each other. And so these are all 4 areas that we can explore. So in terms of systems and practices to support success, we know that almost in every educational environment, if students have the opportunity to use their own language, they will, because it's what feels comfortable. We all know what it's like to be sat, 2 English speakers and a French speaker all having a conversation in French. And sometimes it feels a bit weird to speak to another English speaker in French. We all want to default to our comfort language, especially with people who share it as their comfort language. And so if we recognize students are going to use their home languages anyway, we can leverage it for learning and allow it to be constructive and cooperative rather than punitive. We know that punishing children for using their own language or trying to make language rules just has a detrimental effect across the board. So we need to move towards structures that are supportive of making good language decisions. So the first of these is a classroom language policy. So a classroom language policy is co-created with a specific group of students. It's not the same one every year that the teacher just has on their wall, but every year with a new class, you talk about who are we with languages? What are our language profiles? What languages do we know and use? What are we learning? What do we want? What are our language goals for ourselves? And so this is really important, even down to very young learners. They need to think about, well, I'm in this new school and English is the language. I want to be able to play with other children, or I want to be able to read a book easily. Or they can set their own language goals. And then you can make some guidelines, some common agreements, some rules, whatever you call them, about how we use languages in our classroom. And here's where you have the space to explore how do we use languages to be inclusive instead of exclusive. So if we are a table of 4 students that all speak Punjabi, we can use Punjabi when we're all speaking together because that's good for our learning. But if we are 3 students who speak Punjabi and 1 student who doesn't, then to the best of our ability, we're going to use English because that's how everybody feels included. And so again, all the way down to very young learners, we can use our classroom language policies to help them reflect on and make language decisions. Am I being a good classmate? Am I being linguistically inclusive? Am I making sure everybody feels comfortable in my table? Am I paying attention to my own language goals? And so you can use these to bring kids back on track when you feel that how languages are being used is no longer helpful in the classroom. And so you can use this from about 5 years up all the way through into university if you want. The second thing that you can use is what we call choice boards, which is essentially usually at the beginning of a project or something quite, big. You would give children a series of choices about how they're going to engage in that work. So the first choice might be, I'll use my language to plan my work and then use English to do the work. I'll chat with my partner in my own language about the task, but I'm going to do it in English, or I'm going to try to use English only for this task. And so they look at the task and their level of comfort and they decide, I think it would be really useful for me to be able to chat about it with somebody else in my language, but then we can do the work in English. And so you can use these to help them think about their language goals and to kind of move them along that continuum so that sometimes they are comfortable just using the school language. And other times they might say, well, but it will be more interesting for me if I read a story in my own language and then tell you about it in English. Perfectly fine, then you can do that. But again, it's about developing that sense of responsibility around decision making. Okay. There are challenges to translanguaging. So it's not all smooth sailing in the world of translanguaging. And one of the articles that I put up as post-session reading is called Unraveling Translanguaging, and it's about this issue that we have where the term translanguaging has been stretched in so many different ways now that when I use it, I'm thinking of something very different than when somebody working in a bilingual school in the US uses it, or when somebody working in a monolingual school in China uses it. And so it's become the victim of what we call concept creep. It originally meant using two languages in the same lesson by specifying and varying the languages of input and output. And you'll know from the work we did on second language acquisition that now it means a theory of language where we have a unitary language system and all of the languages are part of one system in our brain. And you know, French and English are not distinct languages, they're just a continuum. That's very, very different from specifying and varying the languages of input and output. And so what's happened because of this is that the research that's being done is on a very specific iteration of what that researcher thinks translanguaging is. And so that means that the actual evidence we have for it as a concept is quite sparse and not very robust. And so there are really big claims being made, and we don't have a lot of empirical evidence to support many of them. But that said, in my experience, the vast majority of teachers who engage in multilingual pedagogies are really convinced that it has a positive effect on the students, whether that's for inclusion or well-being, whether that's for language development or for academic development. So one of the things that we really need is to find a bridge between all of this research that's happened that is, you know, very fragmented and not conclusive, and what teachers are very firmly convinced is the case. And so what we need is essentially more research that's collaborative between researchers and teachers, that's looking at a specific iteration of translanguaging in a specific content and measuring impact, so that we can say, for example, in an English-French bilingual program where English is the majority language and French is the minority language, translanguaging strategies used this way impact student development in this way. And it seems like we're reducing it to very minute pieces, but essentially, because language is so variable, that's what we need. We need evidence in our own context. So one of the things that I would ask you to think about as teachers or future teachers is, how can you become a knowledge generator around your own multilingual practices so that you are paying attention to how you're doing it, why you're doing it, and what the impact is on your students, because all of those little pieces come together to form a really large puzzle that's really, really necessary right now. So at the end of this session, and I would encourage you to look at the additional resources in this one, because there's a lot of, quite robust and good stuff that will add to your learning in this way. Thank you very much.